"You have no idea what it costs to run this household," my daughter-in-law said, sliding a piece of paper across the kitchen table toward me. "We've done the math. If you want to keep living here, the number needs to go up." I looked at the paper. She'd written $5,500 a month. I was currently paying $3,200. I didn't say anything. I picked up my coffee cup, walked to the window, and looked out at the backyard, the yard where my son used to chase fireflies as a kid, where my late wife Eleanor planted roses that somehow still bloomed every June. I stood there for a long moment, and then I said, "Let me think about it." That was the last thing I ever gave them for free. My silence. My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, designed bridges in 6 states, retired early because I'd been careful with money my entire adult life, in a way that most people aren't. Eleanor and I lived modestly. We drove used cars. We cooked at home. We took one vacation a year and called it enough. When she passed 3 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than any of us expected, I was left alone in a house that suddenly felt like a museum, every room preserved exactly as she'd left it, every silence louder than it had any right to be. My son, David, called me 2 weeks after the funeral. He said he and his wife, Karen, had been talking. They had a big house in Riverside, 4 bedrooms, plenty of space. Their 2 kids, my grandchildren, Sophie and Owen, were 7 and 9, and always asking about Grandpa. Why didn't I come stay with them for a while, just to get back on my feet? I want to be honest with you. I knew, even then, that moving in with your adult child is a gamble. Eleanor and I had talked about it once, years ago, in that abstract way couples talk about the future when it still feels far away. She'd said, "Promise me we'll never put that weight on them." I'd promised, but Eleanor was gone, and the house felt like it was slowly consuming me. And Sophie and Owen had their grandfather's eyes, and David was my son. And I genuinely thought that it could work. I sold my house in Tucson for $610,000. I put the money into my existing accounts, which at that point held just over $2.1 million in investments, savings, and Eleanor's life insurance. I moved to Riverside in October, 2.5 years ago, with 3 suitcases and a box of Eleanor's photographs. The first months were good. Not perfect. Karen was never warm exactly, more efficient. The way some people are warm in the way a well-run hotel is warm, but it was good. The kids were genuinely happy to have me around. I drove Sophie to piano lessons on Tuesdays. I helped Owen with his 3rd grade reading. David and I watched football on Sunday afternoons and argued about quarterbacks the way we always had. I paid $3,200 a month, which I'd offered without being asked, because I didn't want to feel like a burden and because I knew what mortgages cost. Karen had said, "Oh, Walter, that's too generous." She'd said that in October. By February, she was itemizing the grocery bill. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment about how I left lights on. A suggestion that I shouldn't use the good towels in the guest bath for my morning workouts. A silence at dinner when I mentioned I was thinking of visiting my old colleague Frank in Phoenix for a long weekend. Not an objection. Karen never objected directly. Just a silence that hung in the air until David changed the subject, and I understood that I needed to ask permission for things I hadn't expected to need permission for. I adjusted. I told myself it was her home, her rules, and that I was a guest even if I was paying more per month than most people pay in rent. I tried to be easier, quieter, less present. I ate breakfast early before the family came downstairs. I stayed in my room more. I found a coffee shop 3 blocks away where I'd sit for 2 hours every morning with a book, just to give them space. Then Karen found out about the money. I don't know exactly how it happened. I had a video call with my financial advisor, Richard. In late March, I was in my room, door closed. I thought, and at some point Karen must have passed by and heard enough. The number she heard, I can only assume, was somewhere in the range of what my portfolio had grown to by then. $2.4 million, plus the house proceeds, plus a separate account I kept for Eleanor's memory that I'd never touched. It came to just over $2.9 million total. The paper across the kitchen table came 3 days later. After she slid it to me, after I stood at the window, after I said, "Let me think about it," I went to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand, the one from our trip to the Oregon coast in 2009, her laughing at something I'd said, hair sideways in the wind. I thought about what she would have told me. Eleanor was the kindest person I've ever known. And also, when the situation called for it, completely without sentimentality about practical matters. She would have said, "Walter, when someone shows you who they are, believe them." I believed them. I didn't tell David or Karen anything. I didn't confront anyone, didn't demand an explanation for the number on the paper, didn't ask Karen what exactly she thought $5,500 a month was purchasing that $3,200 hadn't been. I just started making calls. The first call was to Richard. I told him I needed to restructure things, move certain assets, consolidate accounts, set up a few new instruments. He didn't ask a lot of questions. After 18 years working together, Richard understood the difference between me being cautious and me being deliberate. And the way I spoke that afternoon signaled deliberate. We worked through it over the next 2 weeks. I also established a separate, irrevocable trust. I want to be clear about this part, specifically for Sophie and Owen. Whatever happened between me and David and Karen, those two children were not going to be collateral damage. The trust was funded and protected in a way that Karen's name was not on and never would be. The second call was to a real estate agent in a town about 40 minutes north, a smaller community I'd driven through once, and remembered thinking looked like somewhere Eleanor would have liked. I told the agent what I was looking for. Single story, 3 bedrooms, a yard with morning sun, good bones. She called me back within the week, with 3 listings. I went to see them on a Tuesday, while Karen was at her book club, and David was at work, and Sophie and Owen were at school. I made an offer on the second house before I drove back to Riverside. It was accepted the following morning. The third call was to my attorney, Martin. I'd had a will in place since Eleanor's illness. She'd insisted on it, which was very Eleanor. The will had left a significant portion to David. I had Martin draw up revisions. I won't detail every change here, but David's portion was substantially reduced, and the trust for Sophie and Owen was increased. I also added a clause that Martin suggested, one that stipulated the terms under which David could contest, and what he stood to lose if he tried. I did all of this quietly over the course of about 3 weeks, while continuing to have breakfast at my coffee shop each morning and drive Sophie to piano on Tuesdays and watch football with David on Sundays. I did not tell anyone what I was doing. I was not angry, or maybe I was, underneath. But anger has never been useful to me. What I felt, more than anything, was clear. Cleaner than I'd felt since I'd arrived in Riverside. On a Thursday morning in early May, I told David and Karen at breakfast that I'd found a place of my own and would be moving out at the end of the following week. I thanked them for having me. I said I thought it was time. Karen looked at David. David looked at me. "Dad," he said, "this is sudden." "It's not really," I said. "Where?" Karen asked. She was watching me carefully in a way that told me she was trying to calculate something. I gave them the town. I didn't give them the address. The next 10 days I spent packing, arranging movers, and notifying the people who mattered: Frank in Phoenix, my sister Joan in Vermont, a few others who'd wondered how I was doing. Sophie cried when I told her I was leaving, and I held her for a long time and told her that Grandpa's new house had a yard big enough for a swing set, and she was welcome any time. Owen asked if he could have my room. Children are clarifying. I moved on a Saturday in mid-May. The movers were done by 2 in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, I was sitting in the backyard of my new house in a lawn chair I'd bought at a hardware store on the way up, drinking a cup of coffee I'd made in a kitchen that was entirely mine, watching the afternoon light move across the grass. I felt something I hadn't felt in 2.5 years. I'm not sure I have a precise word for it. Peace comes close, but it was more active than that. More like standing up straight after a long time being bent. The first call I got from David came 2 days later. He said he was checking in, asked how the move had gone, said the house sounded nice. It was the most we'd spoken in months where I didn't feel like I was performing ease. I told him it was going well. I told him to bring the kids up sometime. He said he would. The second call, 6 days after that, was different. He started slowly, the way people do when they're working up to something. He asked about the house again, asked about my neighbors, asked whether I'd been in touch with Frank. Then he said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something. Karen and we've been going through some things financially." I waited. "The mortgage on this house it's more than we can carry on our own. We've been counting on your contribution to keep up with payments. Without it, we're going to be in a difficult position." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd considered maybe continuing to help out, not as a living arrangement, just, a loan or a transfer, whatever works for you. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, David, how much is your mortgage payment? He told me. I said, and Karen's salary and yours, what does that come to together? He told me that too. The numbers didn't add up to a household that needed my money. They added up to a household that had grown accustomed to spending, as if my money were permanently attached to theirs. I'm not going to be able to help with that, I said. I'm sorry. There was a long pause. Then, Dad, I don't think you understand how serious this is. I think I probably do, I said. I've been watching it for a while. He didn't call back for 4 days. When he did, Karen was on the line too. I won't recount the entire conversation. Some of what Karen said was frustrated, and some of it was pointed. And at one point, she said something that I thought was intended to make me feel guilty about Eleanor, about how Eleanor would have wanted the family to support each other. And I let that land. And then I said, very calmly, I think you should be careful using Eleanor to make this argument. She was careful with money her entire life. So am I. Karen went quiet after that. What they wanted, it became clear, was for me to either move back in and resume payments, or to effectively fund their mortgage from a distance. What I wanted was to be left alone in my house, with the morning sun, and the grass, and the coffee I made in my own kitchen. We didn't reach an agreement, because there was no agreement to reach. About 3 weeks later, David called again. He said they'd spoken to a real estate agent. They were thinking of selling. He said it in a way that seemed designed to make me feel responsible for this outcome, the way you'd tell someone about a consequence you'd been driven to by their actions. I said, that might be the right call. The market's been good. You might do well. He wasn't expecting that. He'd expected me to step in, I think, to say I'd help. He said, Dad, this house is where your grandchildren live. I know, I said, and they'll always be welcome at mine. There's something I want to say clearly, because I've thought about it a great deal. In the months since, I don't believe I was cruel. I believe I was honest. And I believe I was late, that the honest version of this would have happened a year earlier if I'd been paying closer attention. I contributed generously while I was there. I left without anger. I protected Sophie and Owen. I remain willing to see my son and his family, to have the children up for weekends, to be a grandfather in every way I know how to be. What I'm not willing to do is be managed. To have my presence treated as a financial instrument, my assets treated as household income, my generosity treated as an obligation that accrued interest. Eleanor and I saved that money together, over 31 years, by not spending it on things we didn't need. No one is entitled to it, not even people I love. Sophie called me last week. David must have let her use his phone to ask if she could come for a weekend in July. She wants to see if the yard is really big enough for a swing set. I told her it was, and that I'd have one built before she arrived. I told her to bring Owen. I spent the next morning looking at swing sets online. I found one that Eleanor would have liked: solid wood, good craftsmanship, built to last. I ordered it that afternoon. There's a coffee shop in town, about 4 blocks from my house, that I've started going to in the mornings. The woman who runs it is named Diane, and she's been here 20 years, and she knows everyone by name within a week. She already knows mine. She sets my cup down before I order. I sit by the window. I watch the town start its day. I read, or sometimes I just sit, which is something I hadn't been able to do, just sit, without calculating how much space I was taking up, or how much noise I was making in longer than I care to admit. I'm 64 years old. I have good health, a good house, and a yard with morning sun. I have grandchildren who want to visit, a friend in Phoenix I'm flying out to see next month, and a sister in Vermont who calls every Sunday without fail. I have 31 years of careful choices sitting in accounts that no one can touch unless I decide otherwise. I have a swing set arriving on Thursday, and I have a cup of coffee by the window in a town that's starting to feel like mine. That's enough. It turns out that's more than enough.